If you like the presentation I did 2 days ago, well, this is a sequel. And but it's one that serves purposes other than the one I did the last time, in that I give a little bit of play to the Keynesian model, which most of you know something about. In fact, let me just ask for a show of hands. How many have had just a very basic macro course either in college or high school where you saw a Keynesian cross? You know what a Keynesian cross is? Okay. So those people will be fine. The others, I think, can catch on pretty quickly. We'll see how this works. The nature of the enterprise is to start with the Keynesian cross. Put it through its paces a little bit. I'll attenuate that because I don't have much time. And then show what changes need to be made to cause that model to morph into an Austrian view. And you'll see all of the changes are very healthy changes, recognizing the nature of the capital structure, the workings of labor markets, and so on. And so what it will do is give you a better understanding of both sorts of theories, and show what I think is superiority of the capital-based macro to Keynesian economics. I call it Keynes and Hayek head-to-head, recognizing, though, that these two people were head-to-head in the 1930s. Hayek at LSE and Keynes at Cambridge, and they did battle with one another at the time, and actually even before in reviewing one another's books. They were even closer during the war when the bombing got too bad in London. Hayek moved to Cambridge. The whole London School of Economics moved to Cambridge. And Keynes helped Hayek find a place to live. I mean, these two guys were friends. Hayek would say you could talk to Keynes about anything except economics, you know. But I never quite understood that. But they pretty much talked past one another. Hayek did a better job of understanding where Keynes was coming from than Keynes did of understanding where Hayek was coming from. And I've heard Hayek say that every once in a while he would get Keynes persuaded, but it would never last 24 hours. He says the next day he would say, oh, it's a bunch of rubbish, Hayek, you know, you don't need it. But it turns out it's easier to put them head to head than you might think. Yeah, there they are, okay? Little known photograph. I won't say who looks like he's enjoying that more, but but it wasn't a good experience for either one of them, and Hayek became pretty depressed, and Keynes pretty uppity, like always, okay? So that's the story so far. Now, it's not the end of the show, okay? I want to get into your minds the idea of the alternative visions and frameworks that these two economists had. And let's just look at it. Keynes' vision of the economy suggests circular flow. I mean, that should be familiar to many of you who have taken sophomore economics. Circular framework in which earning and spending are brought into balance by changes in the level of employment. In other words, the economy spirals down or spirals up or spirals wherever it needs to go to get investment equal to saving or to get income equal to expenditure, which is the same thing. Hayek's vision suggests a means-ends framework. See, so there's the contrast. Circular flow, it's a circle. Means-end is a Hayekian triangle with the stages lined up in a temporal sequence, in which means of production are transformed over time. Time is an endogenous variable. It's accounted for in the theory into consumable output. Okay, we've got it. Graphically, the circular flow appears as the Keynesian cross. That's a hump to get over. How do you go from a circle to a cross? We'll see. The cross is intersection identifying the particular state of the economy in which the income and expenditure are in balance. That should ring a bell with you if you've had that sophomore level. Hayek, just from 2 days ago, means ends appears as a Hayekian triangle, the triangle shape depicting an intertemporal pattern of investment over time through the stages. In equilibrium, the pattern of investment corresponds to the intertemporal preferences of consumers. So if you have that correspondence, hey, you got sustainable growth. If you distort it with central bank policy, you got boom and bust. I mean, that's the whole story from 2 days ago. Now I'm going to do a brief review of this Keynesian stuff. And I would argue, in fact I do argue in my own class, that if you set out the Keynesian theory right, then all of its flaws become apparent. Okay, it's only in textbooks where they try to present it to you as if it's correct that it's hard to understand. Okay, let's see how it works. A circular flow. You see it in all the text. You have business organizations, that's just a shell. It's a facilitator of coordination, possibly. Downstairs you have workers, consumers, and investors. That's everyone. All the people are downstairs, but the business organization, that's just the institutional arrangements that allow them to interact with one another. And there's part of the circle. You have labor and other factors of production being supplied by the workers. And soon enough, that other factors drops out of the way. It's all about labor in Keynes' view. They get paid for it. It's called income. Okay? The other half of the circle is the production of goods and services that are bought by these consumers down there who are also the workers and investors. And they pay for that. It's called expenditures. Okay? Now, and you can see here you've got consumption expenditures, consumption plus investment. So they're, right away, you see those two things are lumped together. They're not alternative uses of resources. They're just two different ways you could spend money. Okay? The interest rate is pretty much out of play except as a policy tool. But we can bring that into play. There it is. Federal Reserve policy. And it dictates the speed at which the thing circles. I've got it off right now. We can turn it on. There. So you use circles, okay? My circular flow circles, much better than in the textbook. And it's not circulating very fast, but of course it's not. They've got the interest rate set at 6%. You want it to circulate faster? Well, you rile the animal spirits, and let's see if we can do it. There. Now it's going faster, okay? This is Bernanke at work. Slow it down again. Okay. See, he slows it, too much inflation, slow it down, too much unemployment, speed it up. You know, that's all he's got to work with, you know. And that's the story, okay? Turn that off, okay? Now, the interest rate is pretty much out of play in the Keynesian system. It has a direct but very small influence on investment, according to Keynes. And when it does come into fuller play, like the so-called ISLM model or aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, it plays even more a perverse role than it does here. So I'm ignoring that interest rate effect. Okay, that's Keynes. And what we want to do again is morph into Hayek. Well, we did it there, but we want to do it with the graphics. And of course, with Hayek, he has the Hayekian triangle. That's the means-ends framework. And even there, you saw that temporal element there, and even allowance for the thing to shift resources among the stages of production. Where's that in Keynes? It's gone. It's not there. Okay, it's just totally in eclipse. So essentially, we want to be able to morph from this circle to that triangle. It'll take a little doing, but we'll make it. Now, here's what you've seen in the textbooks. You memorize it for the test. Income equal expenditures. In other words, one side of the circle equals the other side of the circle. And if this were a wholly private economy, you get Y equals C plus I, this consumption plus investment. Mixed economy, throw in government spending. I've learned in Auburn, with Auburn students, when you say wholly private economy, you have to write out the word W-H-O-L-L-Y. Other words, they think it's holy, H-O-L-Y. You know, they think that God ordained it, but no, it's just no public sector. That's all that means. Now, the way you get to the cross is just to take half of this circle over here, consumption plus investment, put it on a vertical axis, and the other half, the income, put it on the horizontal axis. There it is, income and expenditure. Okay, so you look at those two axes, and each one is a half of those circles. Well, you need both halves to be the same magnitude. If they're not, you have trouble. You have excess inventories, depletion of inventories, and the economy setting off into a spiral of some kind. So that 45-degree line just marks the locus where the two halves of the circle are equal, income equal expenditures. And then ground zero for Keynesianism is that consumption equation, which is assumed to be perfectly stable. It doesn't change. Consumption depends on income and nothing else. We can even write the equation for it. It's called C equals some intercept A plus BY. The intercept, of course, is that vertical distance. The slope is the slope of the line. And it's more important for what it denies than what it says. I mean, no one would claim that consumption doesn't depend on income. Okay, when you earn more, you spend more. Well, duh. Okay, we knew that. But Keynes is saying it doesn't depend on anything else, like the interest rate. In other words, the interest rate won't affect people's decisions to consume rather than invest, or rather to save rather than consume. Okay, the interest rate is out of play in that sense. And then we pile investment spending on top of consumption, and that gives us C plus I. All right. And Keynes' point is that investment really isn't a function of anything. It's not a function of income. It's not a function of the interest rate. It just is what it is based on psychological factors. Okay. And here's what he says here. Consumption and investment as well as government spending are portrayed as additive components. Okay. The three components are distinguished largely in terms of their stability characteristics. Stable consumption, unstable investment, and guess what? Stabilizing government spending. So that's what gives you the equilibrium. There's income equal consumption plus investment. Okay? That's the story. And what you note here is that the only adjustment mechanism is income. That if those things aren't equal, if C plus I intersects a 45-degree line at another place, then income will change. The economy will spiral down or spiral up to bring the change about. All right. Now, we're going to start out with this level of income being full employment income. Okay, just by happenso. Only by accident or design, Keynes says. Well, by accident, we're at full employment. How could we show that? I'm going to show we assume we're at full employment. Well, the way I would like to show it is with that PPF. In other words, if you plot consumption against investment, then you should be on the PPF. There's the PPF. And you see where consumption is coming across there. And if that horizontal distance on investment is equal to the vertical distance on investment, and we say it is at this point, I've got them scaled a little differently, but if you're on the PPF, then you're fully employed. Keynes could have done that, but he didn't. He had a different way of showing unemployment. What he did, that's what that says about the PPF. With Keynes, he simply looked at the labor market and to see if the labor market was clearing. He took the wage rate to be a going wage rate. The supply of labor is just what you and I think it is. But the question is the demand for labor strong enough to clear the market at the going wage? That's Keynes' question. And the way he does that is he looks at a labor market like that. I'm just picking a level of income and seeing what the labor market looks like, and sure enough, we're fully employed. Okay? But that wage is a going wage, so-called. We'll even show that's labor income there, which Keynes takes to be all of income, essentially. So now, Y sub FE, that means full employment income. Okay? There's our circular flow again. Now, things look fine. We're at full employment, nothing wrong. What do you suppose happens to make things go wrong? What happens to make things go wrong in Keynes' view? It's certainly not any kind of discoordination that Hayek had in mind. He says there's a collapse in investment due to a waning of the animal spirits. He actually used it. You heard Doug French use that yesterday, Keynes and his animal spirits. He uses that term 3 times in a page and a half. So better believe it, that's what he meant, the animal spirits. There are synonyms. You can say confidence in the economy, fire in the belly, and so on. So there's a loss of confidence, but they're spooked. The investors are spooked by the animal spirits. Now, it's hard to show that on the graph. I don't have an axis that says animal spirits. So you could show it in a slightly different way. There they are. Okay. That doesn't scare anybody, okay? And the investors see that and boom, investment falls. I mean, what would you think? Okay? So now watch investment fall. They're spooked by those animal spirits and investment falls. Okay? And now you don't have the old C plus I plus G. You've got a gap in here between I and the rest of it. And that's excess inventories. Okay? That's what you learned is excess. Did you have a question? E is expenditures. Okay? See, now expenditures are less than income. People aren't spending as much as they're making. And their income is what's paid to get them to produce goods. Okay? But then when they get the income, they don't buy all the goods. And that's where you get these excess inventories. Okay? And once again, let's see if we can show the excess inventories on the circular flow model. How does that? Well, it just means goods are piling up at the firm. Okay, they're not sold. There they are. There they are. They're piling up. Okay. Now, what happens after that? Well, see, you might think that if markets work, you think, well, prices would adjust. The price of those things would come down. They'd have to unload them. But no, this is a fixed model. What happens is the economy spirals downward. It crashes. Okay. And it'll crash, it'll move downwards until once again we have an equilibrium level of income, which is right there. Okay, so the economy crashes. There you go. Now let's look at, here's that change in investment. See that you see the delta I up there? Throw it again upstairs there. There's the change in investment. There's the corresponding change in income. That's why you all had to learn about that multiplier. You know that 1 over 1 minus b is the multiplier. Got that written here. And you can also see that consumption falls. The consumption equation doesn't change. It's stable, but you move along it, so there's a decrease in consumption. Well, right here even you can see that if investment falls and consumption falls, you've come off of the PPF. Okay, you're inside the PPF. But that's Keynes' theory. Okay, and what happens to the labor market? Well, the wage rate didn't change. In fact, one of the interesting things about Keynes, and it sort of follows trivially from this construction that markets are in trouble, the going wage keeps going even after the market conditions that gave rise to it are gone. All right, so market conditions changed, but the wage rate didn't change. The demand fell, but what you have is unemployment. Okay, so that's the unemployment. And of course, the Keynesian solution is to try to rile the investors, rile the animal spirits. If that doesn't work, and he says it doesn't during the Depression, then the government has to take the bull by the horns and start spending. That's the stimulus packages and all of that to increase demand to get the economy back to where it was. Okay. Now, I am going to skip some stuff here because I give a more thorough workout of that, but that's all we need really for our present purposes. And what I want to do now is bring this PPF back into play and keep it in play, all right, and show essentially this same sequence and more using that PPF as well, all right. So it goes like this. There's the economy. It's fully employed, if only by accident, okay. And now we have a waning of the animal spirits. I won't show the spook coming back. You've seen it. Okay, waning of the animal spirits, and you know what's going to happen in the Keynesian cross. But look at the PPF. Look what happens with the PPF. See, the economy falls inside the PPF because both consumption and investment fell. All right, and again you can see, yeah, there's the unemployment. All right, let's carry it a little further. You get a further waning. One waning calls for another. I mean, now that people really have lost confidence, you're in a recession. So it falls some more, like so. The economy crashes again. And there goes even deeper into PPF. You're in depression now. Now it turns out that the path that this dot, or that this position traces out, you're way down in depression, is a linear path. Okay, that's a straight line. And if any of you are doodlers and math bugs or whatever, if you just take C equals A plus BY, and for C substitute in for Y substitute in C plus I, which is the equilibrium condition, and solve that equation, you'll get the equation of this line. All right. So a straight line passes through that. I call it a Keynesian demand constraint. And none of the textbooks draw that constraint. They don't show you. Because to show it is to deny up front that the economy is in trouble. It can't move along the PPF. It has to move only inside it. And when Keynes says it's only by accident or design, he's saying you should be so lucky if you're at this point. Chances are you'll have inflation or you'll have unemployment. Okay? That's his story. We can write the equation. And here I'm just saying if investment were to fall to zero, the economy would settle into an income where Y equals C. And that gives you just a construction point. In other words, if you fell clear down to here, then that would line up with that intercept, because that's a zero investment, okay? So I just want to show you I got the line drawn right. Okay. Now, again, the vertical intercept there is A over 1 minus B. See, it's the same parameters as a consumption function. And this curve is just as stable as a consumption function. The slope is B over 1 minus B. Just work out the math, and that's the way it turns out. And the equation then, which I call the Keynesian demand constraint, is that. Again, you don't see it in any of the textbooks. When I wrote Time and Money, I thought, even hoped, I would be the first person to get into print this boneheaded simple equation and show its significance. And I failed. It's not that somebody else beat me, but when I got my copy of Time and Money from Routledge, I flipped to page 136 just to see that equation, and there was just a blank space there. They left it out. I didn't get it into print, but I tried. Okay, I tried. So I don't know if we had a Keynesian publisher or what, but it didn't get into print until the second or third printing. Although in the Auburn Library, the copy there, it does have this diagram, because I went over there and put it in. Yeah.
Did it get put in until the second printing?
Pardon?
Did it get put in until the second printing?
Right, second printing.
So is that the paperback or the hardback?
Oh, well, it got put in even in the hardback, and it's in the paperback.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there. It's there. Yeah. Yeah, page 136. It's there. Okay. Now, maybe in the name, I'll skip this. What I was going to show, you just take my word for it, that Keynes doesn't present this in the general theory. In his summing up article in 1937, where he got his story straight, according to Joan Robinson, he talked his way through this diagram, or through this demand constraint. And he says that this relationship, the positive relationship between consumption and investment, is of the utmost importance, but is scarcely recognized by the classical economists. Well, of course, they think you're moving along the PPF. Okay. So Keynes recognized it was there, but he didn't write it, or he didn't draw it. So let me go down here. I want to skip now I want to keep track of the interest rate on this same diagram. And I can put it down here just like we did in our capital base macro, and draw savings and investment, demand for investment funds, the supply of investment funds. Okay, and even Keynes occasionally would refer to this diagram. He just argued that both curves always shift at the same time, and so it doesn't really determine the interest rate. We'll see more about that shortly. Keynes had a habit of arguing like a lawyer. Do we have any lawyers in the room? Okay, well, let me apologize before I explain how. The lawyer argues, my client didn't borrow your lawnmower, and it was already broken when you lent it to him, and it was still in perfect shape when he returned it. Okay? And the idea is, if you can get the jury to believe any one of those things, you've got your client off the hook, you know. Well, this is the way Keynes did. I mean, sometimes he argued that neither saving nor investment depend on the interest rate. They're both vertical. So forget about the loanable funds market. Other times he says, yeah, we can draw it like that if you really want to, but both curves always shift together, and so we can't determine the interest rate. The interest rate must be determined somewhere else. Okay. So he would go both ways. That's what that tells you. He was willing to draw it. He didn't, well, he did put it in his book just to throw it out. Okay. Now, with loanable funds market in play, what I want to do is the same thing again. In other words, I want to let investment fall and see what happens. Now, importantly, this curve doesn't change, because that curve is as solid as the consumption equation. It depends only on A and B, which are parameters of the consumption equation. So if the consumption equation doesn't change, then that curve doesn't change. All right? But still, you need to watch with the two things going on. I'm going to show that twice. Investment fell there, and the demand for investment fell there. That's just two ways of saying the same thing, isn't it? So again you see investment fell. Now how does the economy react? Now if we put on our Hayekian hats, we can say, look Maynard, here we have a disequilibrium. The current rate of interest is higher than is justified in the market. The rate of interest should fall, and that will increase the investment by moving along the curve. Plus, at a lower interest rate, people will save less and they'll spend more on consumption goods. So that's all that's going on there. But Keynes is there to say, no, Hayek, that won't happen. What would happen before is, guess what? The economy crashes. Okay, the economy crashes. In fact, if you're studying Keynesianism, you learn pretty quickly that if anything happens, the economy crashes. Well, of course it does, because the wage rate, the price level, the interest rate are all independent of people's preferences. They just are what they are, going wage and so on, and psychologically affected investment. And so if anything happens, then market conditions are wrong and the economy crashes. So let's watch the economy crash here. I think that's what we're going to do. See, the spiraling downward of income implies that saving of loanable funds, the supply of loanable funds, that saving, also shifts leftward, see? So if the economy spirals downward, income goes down. When income goes down, saving goes down, as represented in this diagram by a shift in the savings function. This savings here will shift left. Okay, let's watch it. Okay. And now the economy's in the dumper again. Do we have the labor market? Yeah, there's the labor market. So there's the economy in the dumper. And so you can see what Keynes's point is, that why carry this loanable funds market along anyhow? Because both curves shifted, and they shifted by the same amount. The interest rate didn't change. So what good is, we don't need to keep track of the interest rate. It depends on other forces. He says forces of a different kind. It kind of more spooky. Turns out it's fetish of liquidity preference, and all that. Now, to me, here's something that was encouraging when I noticed it. As I had mentioned earlier, that Keynes has one-in-one diagram only in the general theory, and it's this loanable funds theory. And get this, and it's in there to make this very point. Okay, this is the point that Keynes is making when he puts that in there. It's kind of funny. All the interpretations of Keynes, and they just multiply even still, they never quite focus on this, which I think is sort of ground zero for the difference. I can even pull up the general theory. There it is. That's the only diagram in Keynes' books on page 180. Keynes was terrible at drawing diagrams. Anybody notice the ultimate sin in drawing a diagram here? Didn't label the vertical axis. Okay, what's on the vertical axis, Maynard? Okay, and so of course it's saving and investment. You can see it down here. There's investment, saving, measured vertically. Okay, well let's put it on there for him. Okay. Okay. Now this diagram is sort of backwards. I mean, he's got saving and investment on the vertical axis, and the interest rate, he calls it R. That's the British spelling of interest, I think. No, it means rate of return on investment. Rate of return on investment. So that's a broadly conceived interest rate, which is what we want. But the conventional way is to flip the axis. So you have to take this diagram and kind of flip it over and then rotate it. Okay? Well, I've done it. I've done that for you. So it looks like that. Now his supply looks kind of funny because it's bowed the wrong way. Well, it doesn't draw graphs very well, I'm sorry. Some of those graphs are just red herrings, and they're just to show that income is a shift parameter. See, there's no income in this diagram. So if income changes, then saving can change. So he just wants to show that it's a shift parameter. But if you clean it up and eliminate the graphs that turn out not to be part of his argument, that's the diagram you get. Okay? Now, his whole point in this diagram, and I'll let you read the prose yourself because you really have to decipher it, translate it into American or something. And his whole point is about this matching shift of the savings schedule. He says if the demand for investment funds shifts left, then the supply of investment funds shifts left too, and by the same amount, so that the interest rate doesn't change. That's his argument, which is just the same thing on on our PowerPoint. In fact, if you look over here, what he's saying is that the economy goes from that hollow point, which now is the old equilibrium, to a new point, changing both saving and investment, but not changing the interest rate. Okay, that's Keynes's argument. So we're true to Keynes, much more so than most interpretations of the general theory. So that diagram right there can be seen as taken right out of the general theory, although I didn't do that. I've put it together and then noticed it in there, yes.
Did Keynes ever account for the positive?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, but his account was more psychological effects. In other words, when people see this going on and you get no change in the interest rate, they get worried, they don't know what's going on, so what do? They start hoarding money. You know, that's a big part of his theory. They hoard money. They sell their bonds and hold cash. And when they do that drives up the interest rate, drives it up, which is to say that it just adds to the perversity, because you see here it needed to go down. Okay. So if the market is doing its job, which is equating saving and investment, it would have to go down. But if it's simply equilibrating people's desire to hoard money with the actual existing quantity of money, then it moves perversely. Okay, so I'm leaving out that little piece of perversity. Yeah.
Why saving and investment? People, if they hold cash, how does it translate into investment?
Oh, well, very poorly. The only way it could translate would be through a decrease in the overall price level, which would also affect investment goods and make them more attractive. But it's a fixed price model, so that doesn't happen. And that became the big argument between Cecil Pigou and Maynard Keynes, the so-called real balance effect, that if prices fall due to increased hoarding, then people have the incentive actually to spend out of those hoards. Okay? But that's not part of this model, and it's something that Keynes eventually said, well, okay, I see the logic, but don't count on that to save the economy from a depression. Well, let me press on here. And this is the way we can actually morph into the Hayekian system, because so far all I've been dealing with is this animal spirits and the collapse in investment demand. But Keynes also argued that a change in saving, if people decide to save more, that can cause the economy to collapse. Well, yeah, that's just a particular instance of if anything happens, the economy collapses, including people decide to save more, okay? The economy collapses because wage rates, prices, and everything is adjusted to the old preferences, and it doesn't change to accommodate the new ones. This is right out of the general theory. Every attempt to save more by reducing consumption, I don't know how else you'd say more, will also affect incomes that the attempt necessarily defeats itself. This is the paradox of thrift. In other words, he says it's necessarily the case. It doesn't just happen to be the case, or the case if the economy is working perversely. It's necessarily the case that the economy spirals downward. Okay? So we want to show that using this framework. And we can do it fairly easily, but let me prep you for it so when everything goes on at once, you'll know what's going on. Now what's going to happen is consumption will fall. And of course, if consumption falls, so does C plus I. Not that investment changes, but investment is piled on top of I. So when consumption falls, C plus I falls too. When people save more, that means that curve shifts to the right. They save more, okay, at each and every level of interest. And even this curve will shift because, as we've already said, that curve is stable, or at least as stable as the consumption equation. But if consumption falls, that's really a change in A. There'll be a change in the intercept here. If consumption falls, then this curve will fall too. Okay? So when I pull the trigger, you get all those changes. Let's see how it works. There they all go. Okay? So you can see what's happened. People have just decided to quit consuming and are going to save instead. And see, people now, according to the statistics, are saving 6-7% of their income, whereas before the crash, they were saving, anybody know the percentage? Zero or negative 1 or 2% of their income. So they've gone from negative savers to pretty substantial savers. And the Keynesians are all worried about this because of the paradox of thrift. If people save, it means they don't spend. And spending is what we need to get that circular flow going, you see. That's the way it works. So now we have more saving. People are trying to save more. Okay. But what happens? Well, of course, the economy crashes because it's up here and it's got to get down there. Because you got all those excess inventories, people aren't buying stuff. And the economy will crash until you get down to where you work off those excess inventories. But when the economy crashes, what happens to saving? It falls too. So you have to see that saving shifted out because of people's preferences. It shifts back because the economy goes in the dumper. Okay? I want to save more, but I cause the economy to crash, earning less income out of which to save. You end up saving the same amount as before, but out of a smaller income. That's the paradox, Keynes' paradox of thrift. That's what it's called. He uses that term in the general theory. Okay, so let's watch the crash. Here I'm just showing you, I got the thing drawn right. See, I've still got that lined up there. We got that. Okay, now the crash. That just tells you about it. Gets you ready for it. Here we go. Okay. Now see, we're inside the frontier. We're in a depression. We've got the same old supply and demand for loanable funds, but at a lower level of income, and the same old interest rate. Again, why Keynes didn't want to carry this whole graph along, because it's redundant at best. Okay, and the economy has got unemployment because the wage rate hasn't changed, although the demand for labor has fallen. Suppose you taught sophomores Keynesian economics using this set of graphs rather than what's in the textbook. Would they go for it? I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, now I reset it back just to the basic diagram. And what I want to do is morph this into the Hayekian theory. And the way we do it is realize that this level of consumption, see, that's consumption from here up to here. Well, for Hayek, that's simply the output of the final stage of the Hayekian triangle. Isn't that right? So what I want to do is get rid of the circular flow and bring in the means-ends framework, which is that Hayekian triangle. All right? Like that. And now for starters, I want to let the Keynesian mechanism remain in place. This economy is still going to behave just like Keynes thought it did. All right? We're at full employment, but now see, with Keynes, he looks at the labor market. It's the labor market for each and every stage. And so it looks like this, okay? So it's not stage specific, is that one labor market, supply and demand for labor, applies to each and every stage.
Hayek?
Pardon? No, we're still with Keynes. See, we've got the Hayek framework, but we've got the Keynesian story. So the mechanisms are going to be the same. I'll switch later to do the morphing. Thanks for asking, because you need to see that, okay? So the market mechanism's in place. See, you asked too soon. I need to move that piece of text. Okay. So in accordance with the paradox, an increase in saving causes the economy to spiral downward to a less than full employment level. Well, let's show the increase in saving. And of course, here we can only show it with the demand constraint and the supply of saving. There it is. There's the increase in saving. But what happens? The economy crashes like that. And for Keynes, the structure never changes. In fact, Keynes says, let's see if I think I put this on here. Yeah, see, now you just have unemployment, like so. And what Keynes says is that in chapter 4, he says, we'll assume a fixed structure of industry. He never relaxes that assumption. A fixed structure of industry. Yeah, call it a triangle if you want to, but it never changes shape. It can only change in level of capacity utilization. All right? And so you get this derived demand effect here, but the derived demand effect percolates all the way down. There's no interest rate effect. Well, of course, for Keynes, the interest rate doesn't change because that curve shifted out, then back, and you got the same interest rate. And even if it did change, investment's not sensitive to the interest rate. So that's what that says. Derived demand effect works undiminished at all the earlier stages. The interest rate effect is out of play. The leftward shift of saving took the downward pressure off of interest rate, and in any case, the capital structure is assumed to be fixed. Read chapter 4. Okay? So that's what you get from Keynes. Okay, now here we get the what I see as three modifications we need to make to go from Keynes to Hayek. And the first modification, divide the structure into stages. Okay, structure production stages, so that you can get some relative movements within the stage of production. We can do that. So there's the stages of production. Now, get rid of the labor market and have a stage-specific labor markets so that wage rates can change differentially among the stages and corresponding with changes in the interest rate and the level of activity in the late stages and early stages. So here, this will make you feel good. Let's see, you pull the trigger. You get rid of this, you bring down that. Okay, now you're back to Hayek. So we're ready to go. Oh, we've got one more change. Get rid of the Keynesian demand constraint. See, if now the structure can move this way, and labor can shift, and you can shift that production structure around, then you can move along the PPF, and you're not constrained by that Keynesian demand constraint. Let's see if we can get rid of the demand constraint. There it goes. Okay. So. That feels good, doesn't it? It just feels good. It feels good. And so having done that, we got the Austrian model. It's the Austrian model. So we just made those three changes. And now if you get an increase in saving, okay, a little hyperbole, a gateway to growth, okay. So you don't have a paradox of thrift, you have a gateway to growth. And if people want to save more, like that, then the market economy, with everything in play, will translate those preferences into a shift in the intertemporal preferences. So you get the movement along the PPF, you get the reallocation of resources, you get the wage rate gradient that moves labor where it needs to go, and you've got a market at work. Yes?
Structure production remains static. Because production structure had to come.
Uh-huh.
So to me, it's a non-sequitur. They don't expect it.
Yeah, well, the modern excuse goes something like this, that we're only holding it static for purposes of short-run variations, which is to say business cycles. Well, they blew it there because business cycles is about change. And of course it can change, and we let it change when we're dealing with issues of long-term growth. So any kind of change in the structure of capital intensity is usually what the moderns say, is research done in a long-run perspective on the issue of economic growth. But if you want to do business cycles, you want it short-run, and you hold the structure of production constant.
But we're still back to the problem that you on Monday that they will do the short-run.
That's right. That's right. In fact, I've just read an article. It's a great article. I mean, it's an enlightening article called "The State of Macro." The State of Macro, written by an MIT economist, Olivier Blanchard. It's a big gun. He deals with all the general equilibrium theories in macro. And he says, we're going to cover the field. We're going to cover the short run, and we're going to cover the long run. He says, the only thing we're not going to cover is the medium run. Because that's where it all happens. So, yes.
How did they explain, like, the emergence of totally new industries, like tech industry and computers, and, you know, that didn't even exist? Like, what do they think about that?
Well, again, that's part of growth theory, not part of short-run macro, short-run business cycle. Okay. So, anyhow, there's the morphing, and so now we've gone from, see, there's what Keynes says. Or Hayek had Keynes down pretty well. He says, Mr. Keynes' aggregates conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. Okay? And my PowerPoint pretty much elaborates on that. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We have some questions with the mic.
I was asked, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the society didn't have so much capital stock.
Right.
In case, would the Keynesian economic better apply in that there's not much structural production?
Right. Yeah, but you had a lot of other things going on. You had some international trade flows, and all of the manipulation was in terms of trade restrictions, the old mercantilist system. So you still had the interruptions in spending flows, even though there wasn't much capital. But I agree that if you go back to where there's no capital, then there's not much different between a Keynesian view and a Hayekian view. But of course, in that period, there wasn't much theory either, because there wasn't much to theorize about. Yes?
Roger, would you repeat the question for audience?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, would the Keynesian theory be more applicable before the Industrial Revolution when there wasn't much capital anyhow? Okay. I won't repeat my answer. You see, you get, yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I understand the question. It's about the business of a steady state and the relationship between saving and changes in that structure of production. And let me just say, there was a debate going on. I think we've got it settled between Joe Salerno and myself, where he initially objected to my depicting the economy as experiencing some ongoing investment, secular growth that was sustainable, because his point was that if no further change in preferences occur, the economy will only grow up to the point where that amount of saving is just enough to cover replacement capital, and then it will be in a final state of rest. Sounds more like a graveyard actually than an equilibrium, but it'll be in some final equilibrium. Okay, and I think he's right. If you read Mises, that's what Mises talks about. Mises worries about the long run, the evenly rotating economy or the final state of rest. And here I'm trying to focus on what Larry White calls the cycle relevant run. Okay. Let's look at a long enough run where we take into account the mechanisms that change that structure and reveal the growth as being sustainable or not sustainable. And I would spot Joe his arguments that yes, if there's no changes in preference, eventually the economy will settle down with just savings covering replacement capital. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, yes.
I just want to see if I got my asterisk on the right point. You said the central point is, instead of the paradox of thrift, we have the gateway to growth.
Yeah,
that's kind of the crux of the whole thing.
Yeah, that was my little hyperbole about gateway to growth, but that's right. Yeah, that's right. In other words, another way of saying it is the market works, but you have to leave it alone and let it work, and you don't analyze it by assuming that you have a going wage that doesn't change and that the prices are all fixed prices and that the investment is motivated by animal spirits. Because if you assume those things, then forget the theory. It follows trivially that the market's not going to work. Okay. And that's what he called the general theory. It's amazing, yeah. It is online, yeah. Yeah, if you Google, I've been telling you this, Google my name, Roger Garrison, and it will pop up me and the sheriff of Gwinnett County. and then on my homepage, there's a LVMI lectures, and I think the first show was the one I showed 2 days ago, and the second show is this one. I'm not sure I have that animal spirits spitting anything. I might have to update to get that on there. Okay. Yeah.
You say 50% of our salary goes into 401k, which goes into a mutual fund, and it's Procter & Gamble. How is that savings? How is that going to transform on and positive $1,000?
Well, I mean, you really traced out the path. How does saving in the form of how is it you're going to save originally? Mutual funds or something? Yeah. Well, when the mutual funds buys that stock, Procter & Gamble or anything else, or buys the bonds, they're essentially lending money to the producer, and they can lend it more cheaply because you're saving the money. And lending it more cheaply is going to inspire not only more investment, but more investment in the earlier stages, because the discount effect is in operation there. Okay? Lower interest is going to give you a longer term investment. That's right. Yes?
How good, so we will rise up.
From
your point of view, how well?
Well, and so the question is GDP a good indicator of how well the economy is doing? And the answer, of course, it is to a Keynesian, because that's what he's looking at, the flows. He's looking at the overall macro flows. And if they're flowing fast, a high GDP, then that's good. Okay. But the Austrians want to break it down and look at consumption and investment instead. And I think that what I like to look at is the saving rate, which being zero for a number of years is significant, and look at the interest rates. With the Federal Reserve, you see, one of the problems is that with a Federal Reserve in play, there's no way to observe the natural rate of interest or the market rate of interest. So that's just cut off. In the same way that in the old Soviet Union, you couldn't observe the market price of shoes. You didn't have a market for shoes. But in the case of the Fed in recent years, when they had the Fed funds rate down to zero and kept it there for a year, it's a pretty easy call to say that's too low. The real rate of interest was negative. Okay? And how in the world can you get that low a rate of interest with nobody saving? With savings equal to zero. So it's a pretty easy call there to say you're headed for trouble. The Taylor, yeah.
And the market can based on
right,
so
right.
What are your comments on that kind of rule?
Well, the question is, what about the Taylor rule that will help you figure out what interest rate to target? Okay. Again, it's very Keynesian oriented in the sense that it helps you target a rate that sort of makes the people worried about inflation about the same as the people that worry about unemployment. In other words, it's all about moving up and down that Keynesian demand constraint and making sure that you're not biasing it towards inflation or biasing it towards unemployment. All right. Now, the Taylor rate rule has a real rate of interest hardwired into it. It's a 2% real rate. That's just part of the equation. And so it doesn't allow for changes in that rate. Greenspan argued that the real rate, so Greenspan says, well, don't judge me by the Taylor rule rate, because the real rate of interest did change. You have this glut of saving from the Far East, okay, from China and so on. And so the real rate was lower. Maybe it was. It probably was. Okay, the Chinese saved a lot. But still, you got a problem. In fact, the way I showed that there's a contradiction in what Greenspan says in his book, and especially the epilogue of the paperback edition, he makes two claims that are not consistent with one another. One claim he makes consistently, repeatedly, is that you never know if you're in a bubble until it bursts. You just never know. And Greenspan seemed to be the last one to know. We were still young. We're in a bubble. You never know you're in a bubble until it bursts. And at the same time, he would say, I wasn't holding the interest rate too low. I was just following the interest rate down based on the increase in saving. That's all I was doing. That can't be right. If you never know you're in a bubble until it bursts, then you never know whether you're holding the interest rate to match the market rate or possibly are below it. And guess what? He was below it because it burst. Okay. So he can't claim agnosticism on one count. We don't know if we're in a bubble, but we know that we're holding the interest rate down only because there's a decrease in saving or increase in saving. You see that? You can't have it both ways. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.